All right, so guys, today we're going through the rest of the amendments here. Um, so only 17 amendments have been passed since since the Bill of Rights were passed in 1791. Okay, so some amendments lately, some people have talked about an amendment to ban burning the flag and certainly marriage issues. But the last one was passed in 1792. We'll get to that in a little bit. The 11th Amendment is not one in which I'm going to focus on a whole lot. Basically, back in the day, you had private citizens that ended up trying to sue states in federal court for various things. And so the basic thing you need to know about the 11th Amendment, again, the 11th Amendment almost certainly will not affect your life in any way, but unless you try to sue a state in federal court. But what it does is it protects states against lawsuits in federal court by citizens of other states or other nations. Okay, and there you have your proposed and ratified date. Very, very soon in the Republic, George Washington is still president. Here's one that's easier to understand. At the very beginning, when we elected presidents, you would have originally a winner was the president. After they counted the electoral votes, the second place was the vice president. This caused a problem in 1796 because this guy is elected president. He finishes first. This guy, Thomas Jefferson, this is Adams, Jefferson finishes second. Problem is, this guy's a Federalist. This guy's a Democratic Republican. They were of two different parties. They weren't even, on the same team per se. And so what the 12th Amendment does is place people essentially as running mates, okay? So it changed the way we do this ballot system. Two presidents were chosen this way, Jefferson and John Quincy Adams. Well, at least that's for the tiebreaker in the House. So basically what the amendment did is that second bullet point. There's now separate balloting for both offices. So you won't have the likelihood that you'll have a president of one party and a vice president of the other is very, very, it's not going to happen anymore. All right, the 13th Amendment. Okay, so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment all deal with the same content standard for our class. They all deal with the Civil War and right after the Civil War. So the 13th is the easiest to understand. You guys know that we fought the Civil War for, over slavery, and it gets rid of slavery in this country. It abolishes slavery. It's proposed in January of 1865. Lincoln is still alive. He's assassinated in April of 1865. So he does not get to see it actually ratified by the states, unfortunately. So then, the 13th Amendment and then the 14th Amendment, you end up having to think of, and a little more information on the 13th there. You can read through that at your leisure. But the 14th Amendment then had the question here. So the question was, okay, if these people who used to be slaves are now no longer slaves, what are they? And there was a big push for citizenship. We have to make people who are born here citizens, okay? And so that's the main issue here. You abolish slavery with the 13th. You create citizenship with the 14th, okay? And there are other things with the 14th. There's a part in there that says people are equally protected before the law. There's this idea of states should honor other states' laws. It's called privileges and immunities. So there is other things, but for our purpose for this particular unit, I want you to know that the 14th really granted citizenship to former slaves. Okay, we'll deal with the other stuff later in the year. And so now that you have, the due process clause, everybody, no state shall get in the way of denying people fair treatment before this was big because after we abolished slavery and slaves are now citizens, the southern states were trying to get in the way. And the 14th Amendment has been used in Supreme Court cases more than any other because people were trying to get in the way of slavery. Well, I'm sorry, trying to get in the way of black men being able to be accepted as citizens. But if you're a citizen now, okay, so let's just take this gentleman right here. Let's say that he was a former slave. Well, he's not a slave anymore because of the 13th. Now that he's not a slave, he's a citizen because of the 14th. And what is the very basic thing that citizens can do? Well, that's vote. Okay, and that's what the 15th Amendment does. It gives African American men the ability to vote. It's key there. It's not women yet. Okay, so not even white women here can vote. Not black women. It is really specific to African American men. Race cannot be used to deny someone, a male, the right to vote. All right, the 16th Amendment, very straightforward, okay? This allows the income tax, okay? There was a previous Supreme Court case in which the federal government tried to impose an income tax. It was challenged by the states. The Supreme Court said, you're right, they cannot, there's nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government can impose an income tax. And then the income tax amendment, the 16th, was proposed in 1909. Several years later, it is ratified, and that is why the federal government now is able to take money out of your paycheck, because we passed an amendment to allow them to do so. All right, so the 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. We, the people, now, we vote for members of the House of Representatives and we vote for members of the Senate. But before 1913, we, the people, only got to vote for members of the House of Representatives. Senators were chosen by members of each state's legislature. So, those people were chosen by the people, so in a way we indirectly chose senators. But there was a lot of corruption, and the Senate was seen as the millionaires club. You got in there and, through various means of bribery and stuff. So the 17th Amendment then allowed for the people to actually elect senators. It was a big change. 18th Amendment is prohibition. Many of you have heard of that. Okay, so in this country there was a movement, mainly from women, called temperance, who were saying that their husbands were, becoming alcoholics. They were beating them. They were not honoring their marital obligations. And so this movement pushed for a ban on manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. Key to note that drinking it is not necessarily illegal, though. Okay, it's just making it, selling it, and transporting it. The 19th Amendment, pretty straightforward here too. The push for women being able to vote is done in right after the 15th Amendment. After African American men get the right to vote, there's a big push for many decades to try and do this. Okay, remember, states are in charge of voter qualifications. So states actually, as early as 1890, Wyoming allowed women to vote. But it isn't done federally, okay, until 1920. In August of 1920, it is finally ratified when Woodrow Wilson is president. Okay, so the lame duck amendment, the 20th Amendment, another one here that deals with the presidency and Congress. Okay, so way back in the day, the president and Congress would take office in March. Okay, and so the issue here is this: You would have an election in November, okay? New members of Congress and a new president may be elected. They would not take office until March. So basically, you're dealing with lawmakers and a president. Let's say the president got voted out of office. He's still president from November when the election happens till March when he leaves office and the new president comes in. So what they did was they moved up the dates. Okay, so from November now to January, there's a shorter, what we call lame duck period. And most of the time in the lame duck session, not a whole lot gets done. Okay, and so the idea of the 20th Amendment is to kind of make government more efficient. 21st Amendment, very easy. The little experiment of banning the sale, production, and distribution or transportation of alcohol in this country failed miserably. We did ban it, but that just made people like this guy, Al Capone, very rich, making illegal booze. So the 21st Amendment gets rid of it, and that is why it is legal now, as long as you're 21 years of age and older, to drink alcohol in this country. 22nd Amendment is another presidential one. This one is limits the president to 2 terms, and that's kind of not exactly accurate, but he has a two-term limit. It is in response to FDR's presidency. Franklin Roosevelt served he was elected to 4 terms. He died shortly after he won his 4th term in office. So he was president for longer than any person in history. And he actually breaks the rule set by George Washington of 2 terms. And that was an unwritten rule, if you remember, of custom. So the max number of years a president can serve is actually 10. Now, most people would say 8 when they say 2 4-year terms. But if a president finishes, like if let's say a president is assassinated and they are more than halfway through their term, the vice president can take over, finish up that term, and then run for 2 more elections. So technically, 10 years is the maximum number. Okay, and this is ratified in 1947. The 23rd Amendment is not one I spend a whole lot of time on because it does not affect us per se. But Washington, D.C., D.C. stands for District of Columbia. And Washington, D.C. was originally set up as a federal, it is a federal district. It was basically where the federal government would operate. It eventually became a large city where people actually lived. And because of the way the Electoral College is set up, it has votes in it from each state. And so technically people in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., really didn't have a voice when it came to voting for president. And they still don't have members of Congress, but now at least, because of the 23rd Amendment, they actually do get to vote in presidential elections, and Washington, D.C. has 3 electoral votes, just like other small states do. 24th Amendment, the poll tax. After the 15th Amendment is passed and the African American men get the right to vote, and during the early 1900s and into the 1960s, many southern states tried to charge poll taxes to kind of try and limit African Americans from voting. Many of whom are poor, and they do not have enough money, and so there was a discriminatory practice to try and weaken African American political power, and it was quite effective actually. So the 24th Amendment actually gets rid of the idea of poll taxes in federal elections. So they can't, states can't do that anymore. Having enough money should not be a reason someone is denied the right to vote. And another, the The last of the presidential amendments is the 25th, and it is large in response to the John F. Kennedy assassination in 1963. It made it official that the vice president becomes a new president in the president's absence. This was not, it was always done. Okay, the first president to die in office was way back in 1841 with William Henry Harrison, and his vice president did assume the presidency, but it was very controversial at the time. People said that he couldn't be the president. All the Constitution said was that the powers are assumed by the vice president. It didn't actually say he becomes president. And so the 1967, when this is ratified by Congress, or ratified by the states rather, it does make it official that the president is in charge. It also provides for ideas about incapacitation. So if the president is under anesthesia or something like that, the vice president can temporarily take over the office. And we'll talk more about this when we actually talk about the executive branch, but Presidential Succession Act of 1947 actually says, who is in line to take over the presidency, and there's a very long list of offices. And if everybody died, the last guy on the list or last lady on the list would become president. But again, we'll talk about that more later. In 1971, the fastest amendment to be ratified. Okay, March of 1971 is when it is proposed by Congress, and July of 1971 is when the 26th Amendment is ratified by the states. And the reason it was so quick is because it just made sense. American GIs in Vietnam were going off, they were dying in Southeast Asia, and when they come home, they weren't able to vote. The voting age was 21 in many states. And so consequently, they said, it's not fair. We're old enough to die, but not old enough to vote. And it was a very obvious mistake. And so that's why it didn't take very long. Once the amendment was proposed, it was ratified very quickly by the states. And the last of our amendments was ratified in 1992. And basically what the 27th Amendment does is says that members of Congress, if they vote to give themselves a pay raise, they don't get that raise until they win another election. Okay, and the amendment, if you notice, was actually proposed along with the rest of the Bill of Rights in 1789. And it did not get enough states to ratify it then, and it had no due date on it. And some guy, this guy Gregory Watson, he found it. He was a research guy at some university, and he began to push to get this passed. And so in 1992, after that many years, the 27th Amendment actually becomes part of the Constitution, which is pretty cool. All right, so that's it. That's the rest of the amendments right there.